Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group's 2023 to 2024 program. It's complicated. This year's session seeks to reclaim the phrase "it's complicated" as a tool for unraveling one's colonial issues surrounding heritage throughout time. Without further delay, I'd like to warmly welcome today's speaker, Nikolas Orr. Nikolas is a finishing PhD candidate in contemporary history. The focus of his research is on the defacement and destruction of objects of colonial heritage. He's working on the current paper for submission to the Journal of Settler Colonial Studies. Nikolas' topic today will be "I Was Both Tyrant and Slave, Chicano or Chicana Identity and Complex Relationships with Symbols of Colonialism, circa 1968 to 1976. Welcome, Nikolas. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabella and Ria. It's great to be here. It's a very late evening for me, but great nonetheless. I'll get started so that we have as much time for discussion as possible at the end. I'm really looking forward to that part because, as Stanley said, I'm developing a paper for Settler Colonial Studies, the journal, and I'm at a point in which I think I need some input. So let's get going. So the purpose of today is really, or the context of today's presentation is drawing on my PhD thesis, which I submitted about 3 weeks ago. And it expands on that thesis, which was on the topic of anti-colonial iconoclasm practiced by Indigenous groups in the latter part of the 20th century. By anti-colonial iconoclasm, I mean the defacement or destruction of colonial symbols, especially monuments. The thesis focused on the three most prolific sites of Indigenous iconoclasm of the period: the United States, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. In it, I showed that American Indian, Aboriginal, and Maori activists made significant use of iconoclastic methods in the period. I'd always intended to include Chicanos in that study, Chicanos being a racial and cultural category conceived in the 1960s, a category that claimed Indigenous status for Mexican Americans in the southwestern United States. I'd reasoned that the increasingly visual modes of protest of the 1960s and 70s, demonstrated by the Black Panthers and the American Indian movement, would also be present in Chicano actions. I ended up cutting that chapter from my thesis for a number of reasons, the simplest being that it just didn't fit in the word limit. But even if there had been room, the challenges to the concept of Chicano indigeneity made by Native American nations and by scholars such as Chicana geographer Laura Pulido caught my attention and seemed highly problematic. They suggested to me that Chicano's contestation of colonial symbols may not qualify as Indigenous iconoclasm. And this is a debate that I'll leave to one side, mostly for today, to others more qualified than me, because I'm not Indigenous, I'm not Chicano, nor am I specialized in Latinx or Chicanx studies. I'm a global historian with a particular interest in recuperating histories of resistance through visual evidence. So my decision to exclude Chicanos from a study on anti-colonial iconoclasm was the question of whether El Movimiento, as it was known, was in fact iconoclastic or anti-colonial. And that's the idea I want to explore with you today. Okay, this is working, looking good. So the Chicano identity took root in the urban youth of the southwestern United States in the mid-1960s. It grew out of organizations centered on the concerns of rural Mexican Americans. Terrible working conditions led to the founding of the United Farm Workers in 1962, and they held massive strikes and boycotts against Californian grape growers. The Alianza Federal de Mercedes, or translated as the Federal Alliance for Land Grants, sought to return ownership to New Mexican families of lands taken after the United States annexation of northern Mexico in 1848. Inspired by these groups and by the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements of the time, a new generation of activists in Colorado and Texas founded Crusade for Justice and the Mexican American Youth Organization, or MAYO. So close networking and synergies between these different groups, between these various struggles of labor, land, education and culture, brought the movement to an apex in 1970. That year, Californian growers finally bowed to union demands. High school walkouts against discriminatory education policy in Texas reached epic proportions, and the Chicano moratorium march against the war, the Vietnam War, established a new record for the largest protest by an ethnic minority in US history. The Chicano movement recuperated a sense of pride in its Mexican heritage, defending the idea that Mexican Americans were the rightful owners of the Southwest. The entire Southwest, as you can see in these maps, had been Mexican territory until the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848. That's when the former, Mexico, surrendered more than half of its land under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The treaty was meant to give continuity to existing land titles, yet dishonest practices soon deprived Mexican Americans of their land. The idea that this was their home, therefore, was transformational for a people labelled foreigners and illegal aliens. The land claims that Chicanos made were the outcome of Spanish conquest, a product of colonization. La Alianza, under the leadership of Reyes Tijerina, based its legal arguments on deeds signed by the Spanish crown. Spanish conquest, which preceded US annexation by several centuries, makes this part of the US, the Southwest, a site of double colonization, to borrow the term from Chicana scholar Laura Gomez. Chicanos, insofar as they invoked their Spanish-based land rights, I argue, defended and celebrated colonialism. This was deeply problematic, as you'll appreciate, with respect to the Native Americans invaded and dispossessed by Spain. And this is something that many other scholars have argued and have explored in depth. The Chicano movement forged yet deeper claims on the Southwest by framing itself in the vein of Mexican nationalism as mestizo, or mixed race, that is, part Spanish, part Indigenous. Crusade for Justice, for example, promoted this new position through symbols such as the mestizo or three-dimensional head that you can see on screen. It was composed of a Spanish father, Indian mother, and mestizo child. The mythology grew further in the figure of Aztlan, a legendary site from which the Aztec civilization is said to have migrated before establishing itself in Tenochtitlan, where present-day Mexico City now lies. So those who position Aztlan in the present-day United States thus argued that Chicanos were, in fact, indigenous to the lands identified with American Indian nations. Crusade for Justice founder and leader Jorge Gonzalez encapsulated the idea that Chicanos were both colonizers and colonized in the poem I Am Joaquin. Written in the first person, Joaquin pronounces himself the incarnation of Aztec and Mayan rulers, Spanish conquistadores, and Mexican rebels. Gonzalez wrote, I am Cuauhtemoc, I am the Maya prince, I am Nezahualcóyotl, great leader of the Chichimecas. I am the sword and flame of Cortés, the despot. I was both tyrant and slave. I am Aztec prince and Christian Christ. So, given its pedigree, the Chicano movement held an ambivalent relationship to colonial symbols, and this has been analysed in depth in Chicano literature by people such as Vanessa Fonseca, Maria Herrera Sobek, Ben Olgin, and many others, but only sparingly has it been analysed in the movement's visual practice. In the visual turn in languages of protest in the 1960s, the Chicano movement placed considerable importance on visual activism. Laura Perez offers a compelling interpretation of this work, widely acknowledged as the most iconic example of Chicano art. Rather than destroying the image of American freedom, she argues the artist created a visually continuous and harmonious union between a smiling liberty and a female Mayan warrior. The two figures are supported by the one pair of legs, she argues. That Ester Hernández, the artist, did not disfigure liberty's face suggests, according to Perez, a, quote, respectful engagement between different cultures, end quote. Yet Hernández's benevolent treatment of the monument is surely a response to Lady Liberty's own possibilities as a feminist symbol and beacon of immigration. I ask, what did Chicanos make of more overt symbols of US power? As reclamation of land stolen from Mexican landowners was central to the Chicano movement, efforts were concentrated in northern New Mexico, and one area was the Carson National Forest. The park's namesake, Kit Carson, made a career as an expedition scout and military leader in the mid-19th century, and his role in killing the Navajo and other Indian peoples helped reinforce US control over the Southwest. The creation of the National Forest in his name deprived local Chicano farmers of pastoral land and blocked access to Blue Lake, a site sacred to the Taos, one of the 19 groups configuring the Pueblo Indians. So in 1966, Reyes Tijerina led a caravan of 100 vehicles carrying Alianza members and Native Americans in evicting Forest Service rangers from areas of the Carson Forest, corresponding to the San Joaquin land grant made under Spanish law. A party of 400 men, women and children, many of the adults armed, camped at the Echo Creek campground. They covered, as you can see in the image, government signs in boards reclaiming the land as an independent republic. Other signs were burnt. So their approach to this US power was clearly iconoclastic on this occasion, yet I would argue only partly decolonial. I say this because they sought to decolonize the Carson Forest of US possession, only to recolonize according to Spanish Mexican interests. Tijerina of this contradiction. In November 1968, he ran in the New Mexico gubernatorial election. In the lead-up, his organization was rebranded the Alianza Federal de los Pueblos Libres. So that's a semantic shift away from the Spanish mercedes, or land grants, to the idea of pueblos associated with the Native Americans of the region. In September of that year, El Grito del Norte, a newspaper closely associated with the Alianza, described Tijerina as 80% Indian and only 20% Spanish. The move away from a Chicanismo founded in Hispanic heritage was inconsistent. While enjoying the allyship of some Native Americans, Tijerina continued to cultivate his image as a descendant of Spanish Empire. In this photo, taken during his campaign for governor, Tijerina poses next to a monument of Juan de Oñate, a conquistador of New Mexico. El Grito del Norte published declarations from Chicano writers that they were, quote, the true and direct descendants of Oñate, end quote. So Oñate sustained their claims to land, but also the Chicano movement's cultural identity. El Grito was, on occasion, even a platform for apologias of Catholic and Spanish excesses during colonialism. In the debut issue, for example, one writer characterized Oñate's legacy as a pious, clean brotherhood, full of love and strength of will. Yet Oñate, the first European governor of New Mexico in 1599, went about the mission entrusted him in bloodthirsty fashion. Philip II gave him orders for the religious conversion of the Pueblo Indians and the establishment of a trade route between the Mexican metropole and the rich resources further north. Oñate is most notorious for the massacre of a whole town of Pueblo Indians and the amputation of the feet of its male survivors. So this where Tijerina posed stands at the archaeological site of San Gabriel, the former capital of Oñate's New Mexico. While crouched alongside the monument, Tijerina affixed a campaign sticker that you can see on screen next to the conquistador's name. The conquistador, keep in mind, was the first governor of New Mexico, and here is Tijerina running to be the new governor, so effectively a successor in an Hispanic dynasty. So one of the problems with strengthening Hispanic cultural identity through the celebration of Spanish colonialism is that it reinforces Anglo-American power while further alienating Native Americans. We've seen how monuments to Columbus, Oñate, Junipero Serra, and others may appear to improve the social status of the ethnic minorities that champion them, but they only do so by further inscribing Indigenous dispossession. An editor of a Native American newspaper by the name of McGowan criticized the doctrine of Aztlán on these grounds. McGowan called out what many Indians saw as the Chicano movement's, quote, wish to take over native land, end quote, by undermining native First Nations exclusive ancestral rights. Sensitivity shown by Tijerina towards Native American communities continued to be a feature of the New Mexican political class and their commemorative agenda over the following decades. Monuments to Oñate prospered through the memorial mania of the 1990s and 2000s. One of those monuments is a rampant equestrian statue that you can see in the middle here. It broke world records for its size. It's also true that acts of defacement have occurred in this time. Of the 4 Oñate monuments I've shown today, only the enormous Hauser equestrian remains standing. Tijerina lost his bid for the governorship of New Mexico, and when he did, his supporters took to the forest signs, like they had in 1966. They knocked some down, they torched others, it continued into 1969, and they destroyed more in 1971. In the top right, you can see Patsy Tijerina, Reyes's second wife, and she was actively involved in burning the sign, as you can see in the photo. In addition to forestry signs, Chicano groups targeted state flags. In March 1969, during the inaugural National Youth and Liberation Conference convened by Corky Gonzalez at Crusade for Justice headquarters in Denver, Colorado, there were over 1,000 conference delegates who marched on the state capitol, and a group of those took possession of the state flag. They hoisted in place of the Colorado flag the Mexican tricolor flag. So the limitations of Chicano solidarity with First Nations was evident on this occasion in the choice of targets for direct action. Protesters did not perceive an affront to that statue you can see in the largest image of a Colorado cavalryman and is representative of the Sand Creek Massacre of Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples in 1864 during the Civil War. The protesters in 1969 climbed the monument but directed no criticism towards it. The statue, incidentally, was the object of protest during Black Lives Matter and was removed in 2020. Chicano activists also chose a state flag in 1970, I believe it was, when they protested discriminatory practices in Texas school funding. On that occasion, they didn't raise the Mexican flag, but the red flag you can see on screen, which belongs to the newly formed Raza Unida party, a political party. The flag is shows an eagle and the political boundaries of the Southwest, in addition to the word Aztlán. In the state convention in 1971, Chicano protesters scaled the Alamo cenotaph, which commemorates the Texan volunteers fallen in 1836 when Mexican troops attempted to block Texan independence. The cenotaph stands adjacent to the Alamo, a complex of Spanish colonial buildings serving originally as a mission and later a barracks. In a reversal of the official narrative of Anglo-American victory over Mexico, Chicanos re-inscribed it as one of Hispanic pride through their protest. It was here in 1967 that the Mexican-American youth organization, Mayo, was formed on a picket line in front of the mission building. Note, however, that the history of the Alamo is one of Spanish conquest over First Nations, heritage that the Chicano reoccupation ultimately celebrates. Mayo made a study of monuments as backdrops for its political events. Perhaps the most compelling example was this, its intervention into a statue of the Immaculate Conception at St. Peter's Novitiate at La Lomita, a small hill just to the south of Mission, Texas. Just below that hill flows the Rio Grande, its path delineating the US-Mexican border set in 1848. The religious oblates of Mary Immaculate had begrudgingly allowed Mayo use of this site, a disused seminary, for its 1969 National Conference. But the oblates refused Mayo's request to endow them the building for the establishment of a Chicano educational center. This caused some frustration in Mayo, combined with frustration generally at the Catholic Church's lack of support of Chicano issues. This frustration led to the following action, which the Washington Post captured, and I'll read it. Mayo delegates, festive in berets, brightly colored ponchos, and serapes, climbed the 5-foot-high pedestal one by one to take a turn at spraying the life-size gravestone statue. On the sidelines, 2 guitarists and 3 singers provided an accompaniment of revolutionary songs. Viva la raza, the crowd cried when the Virgin was bronzed from head to toe. Viva la causa. Jose Angel Gutierrez, who is pictured in the photo, recalled in conversation with me that a traditional serape or zarape was hung from the statue's shoulders. The action, I would say, is susceptible to interpretation from several viewpoints. For the Oblate Fathers, it was desecration, no questions asked. It was the work of communist iconoclasts, in their words. But from the vantage of Mexican Catholic practice, the transformation of the white Mary Immaculate into a brown Virgin of Guadalupe, patron saint of Mexico, could be construed as a form of anti-colonial inconformity, of a cultural reworking of an imposed religion. Then, to Native American observers, it may have appeared like a changing of the imperial guard from one oppressor to another. So the action escapes simple categorization as iconoclastic or anti-colonial. This was the modification by a group of high school students of this statue, the comic book character Popeye the Sailor. It stands in Crystal City, Texas. Popeye, who draws his strength from tinned spinach, was honoured with a monument in front of the City Hall owing to Crystal City's title as the spinach capital of the world. The fact that Mexican Americans working for exploitative wages picked that spinach was not lost on the statue's detractors. Emulating Mayo's reclamation of Mary Immaculate, the students painted Popeye's white skin brown in a reivindication of the Chicano community. The slogan "Brown is beautiful" in the vein of Black Power's "Black is beautiful" had become a rallying cry of the movement. Given Popeye's status as a patriotic symbol, the action can also be seen as a critique of the US more broadly. In conclusion, today, can we characterize Chicanismo as anti-colonial or iconoclastic? Although critical of Anglo-American empire, the movement was not consistently critical of Hispanic colonialism. In contexts of multiple colonization, anti-colonial practice, to be considered as such, would need to demonstrate a commitment to countering all obstacles to Indigenous sovereignty. The Chicano movement did not do this over and above its own territorial claims, and so remained at once anti-colonial and pro-colonial. In its critique of Anglo-American dominance, the Chicano movement was mildly iconoclastic, favouring objects of high symbolic but limited heritage value, such as signs, flags, and statues of low production value. In its exaltation of Spanish colonial symbols and veneration of Catholic icons, it tended more towards iconodualism, that iconoclasm's opposite. And with that, I will finish.